We're here today with Nathan Lynch, the head of the money laundering guru from Thomson Reuters.
Just let me clarify, anti, Michael. You got to get the A in the acronym.
Anti money laundering, and
that is fundamentally the fundamental problem that corporate Australia has suffered in the last 3 years is they forgot the A in AML.
So you've had a huge week with the big Westpac, the record settlement for Westpac. Most people think it's the Westpac share price didn't move at all, really. So, in fact, it was flat with the market. So the market obviously expected it.
The market could have expected something far worse, couldn't it? I mean, they'd provisioned 900 million already, which was the bulk of the penalty. So, what's 400 million between friends?
Well,
it's, the market loves the certainty of having this behind Westpac, and they wouldn't want to be distracted and tied up with this for 4 years in court. So I think the market has welcomed the resolution. It's always what we see with these cases. There's a big hit to the share price when it emerges, and then there's kind of a recovery as the market digests the news. And then at the end of it, when the settlement gets paid or agreed, it's sort of a damp squib because it's been
I worked it out, 1.3 billion for 23 million offences works out to roughly $56 a pop, $56 a breaking of the law. Which is about half a buck.
What are parking?
Probably if you get busted for not wearing your bicycle helmet, you might get like about a $56 fine. Do you reckon, mate?
Yeah, well, I think it's worse. So I think the people that were breaking these IFTI reporting laws were definitely paying their parking meters and wearing their helmets to work. But jokes aside, it's not accurate to divide these penalties by 23 million. Because an element of what's known in legal circles as course of conduct applies, which means when your program fails, you very quickly ratchet up a lot of breaches. So yeah, there were 23 million breaches, but fundamentally what it came back to was a couple of simple things, which is, understand your business, understand your customer, have a great risk assessment, put a program in place and follow it, So you could argue, it's $50 a clip, or you could argue it's 1.3 billion every time you get your AML program wrong. I'd prefer to view it that way.
Well, it equates to around about 3 months worth of Westpac's cash profits, and of course Brian Hart's two directors fell on their swords, so there was some responsibility taken, and it was a record fine, so it sent a strong signal to the banks, but. How much do you think it would have cost? I mean, how much would they have profited from having these very lax systems in place?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Try to have a crack at that number or not?
Well, first of all, I just want to object to your notion that people fell on their swords. I think they kind of fell on the futon in their beach house, to be fair. When you walk out of these, terrible situations and with your $50 million, I think in Ian Narev's case, it was $54 million he'd trousered from CBA and left the place in the regulatory equivalent of the third circle of hell. It's hard to say it's falling on your sword in the Japanese sense of it. But look, institutions only do this. They don't make a risk assessment. The risk assessment they make is we're never going to get caught. And if we do get caught, we've got the regulators wrapped around our little finger, which may be true with APRA and ASIC, but the market has had this incredible shock in the last few years because AUSTRAC, being a criminal intelligence agency, effectively, part of the Home Affairs portfolio, is a very different creature.
So what do you think about the future then for Westpac now? Are they out of the woods, or is there a US regulatory menace coming their way?
No, I mean, the regulators work very collaboratively on this. They're all part of a group called Egmont. They're all partners in this, especially the Five Eyes countries work very closely in financial intelligence. So you would never get a situation where one regulator would issue a fine and then another regulator would jump over it, and smash it again. So generally there's a lead regulator, and the lead regulator will be the one, either the home jurisdiction or the one where the most harm occurred. In Westpac's case, both of those are Australia. So, it would be unlikely for FinCEN to jump in now. FinCEN's got some problems of its own, I might add, this week with the FinCEN files. So I think FinCEN, FinCEN will back off. You do see some cases where, for instance, FinCEN and the UK regulator have done a joint settlement with Standard Chartered, for instance. So I think they're in the clear on the regulatory front. The issue they have now, of course, is class actions, potential exposure to class actions. And that's highlighted by the fact that your viewers might be interested to know that, here's an example of the unintended consequences of a little breach. So a couple of years ago, the bank makes a decision not to monitor its light pay channel, which was the problematic channel going to the Philippines. Now, as a consequence of that, the regulatory disaster has taken place, and yesterday, Westpac's directors and officers insurers walked. They basically turned around and said, we don't believe this executive and board are insurable. As of October 1st, you don't get any more back book cover. So this is a massive, massive development. If you're talking about executive accountability, there it is. You've got Australia's second largest banker, top corporate, being told by the international reinsurance market, we think you are an unacceptable risk and we're not going to insure you because of how you've handled this situation.
Wow.
That stuff sends a message to corporate Australia. That changes behaviour.
It does. So Nathan, the backdrop, of course, is the money laundering and counter-terror legislation, the first tranche of which came in I think, 2006. Now, the banks, of course, have to adhere to that. Banks, casinos and bullion dealers and so on were captured by that legislation. But as we've discussed over the years, the second tranche of that legislation, which was supposed to come in, I think, the following year or two, around about 2008, 12 years later, it has not come in. What does that say about the will of the politicians in Australia to comply with the expectations of the FATF and the money laundering regulators globally? I mean, where do we rank in terms of money laundering?
Oh, Michael, I mean, getting legislation through, it's a very complicated process, I mean, what's 12 years between friends? So that's, it would be interesting to judge the federal government, federal parliament. Both sides have kicked this into the long grass over a period of, it's really 14 years because they committed to it in 2006. So, they've cooked it into the long grass for 14 years. That's, 2 cycles of real estate doubling, if you want to put it in layman's terms. Now, you've got to the position where basically they're smashing the banks for failing on anti-money laundering, but who's assessing the government's performance by the same standard? This is a really big problem. So the banks are getting all of the obligations. They're being expected to do all of the heavy lifting in the AML regime, and when they get it wrong, they get 700 million, 1.3 billion penalties. So I think there's going to be a big push now, collectively from the financial services industry to the government to say, you're expecting a lot of us. What can we expect of you?
And so the people that are exempt now, just to be clear, you've got the banks and the bullion dealers and casinos. Of course, the banks have failed abjectly. There was the CBA with its 57,000 transgressions a year or two ago. And of course, lawyers, the big 4 accounting firms, and the real estate fraternity aren't captured by this money laundering legislation. So every time I ring up every year and say, how's this legislation coming along 10, 11, 12, 13 years later, I'm told they're in stakeholder negotiations or consultations with stakeholders. So these are the stakeholders, obviously the property people, the big accountancy consulting firms, and the lawyers, the legal fraternity, which have been remarkably mute about the whole thing. Clearly, they don't want it coming in. So how badly are these establishment players involved in money laundering?
Well, this is a reporting regime, not a criminal regime. So what we're talking about here is forcing them to just provide intelligence when they see something dodgy. Uh, you know, you look at the fact that this regime's come in pretty much everywhere else in the Western world, apart from the US, where they don't have it. But last time I looked, Australia didn't have the world's biggest military and the world's reserve currency. So we're in a position where the world is expecting Australia to act. We've always been a pillar of integrity, low corruption, clean economy, and here we are disgracing ourselves on the international stage. And to be honest, we look like a failed democracy when we can't get this stuff through, which has bipartisan support. So, it's pretty catastrophic. And in a sense, I think the banks are right to call out and say we can't detect this stuff. This is the analogy I use is it's like building a dam wall halfway across the Yangtze to try and stop the flow of illicit money and proceeds of corruption coming down from Beijing, sort of thing. Which is one of the major centres that sends this illicit money to Australia. Not to pick on China, but just to use it as an example. The Australian government is basically saying the money's still getting through. We need to build that dam wall that runs halfway across the river even higher. So, it's a nonsensical strategy. You've got to build the entire structure because illicit money just is going to flow to the path of least resistance.
Yeah. So, which countries, for instance? I mean, you travel and you cover this for Thomson Reuters across the region or globally. Which countries are doing better than Australia that Australia could reasonably be expected to be beating in this compliance sense?
Wow, let's just look at our peers. Pakistan's got its own issues for sure, but they seem to be very committed to it at a government level because they're being threatened to be cut off from the world economy if they don't step up. So it's ironic that Australia can sit there and tick its finger at Pakistan when in effect they're actually doing a lot of stuff at top tier government level to be part of this. So just look across the region at our neighbours, Malaysia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, all of these jurisdictions have moved. All of the major financial centres that want to have a reputation for being clean and a good place to invest have been proactive and got on the front foot and said, we don't want to be seen as a home for dirty money.
Well, can I flip it around the other way? Who are we doing better than?
Who are we doing better than? We're doing brilliantly in the financial intelligence area. So we've probably got the world's best, most innovative, most effective financial intelligence unit in Austrac. Of course, Austrac gets dragged before inquiries like the one that we just had, the parliamentary inquiry into foreign interference and foreign investment. And Austrac is asked, do you need lawyers, real estate agents and accountants to make this regime effective? Of course, it's a big charade because they are told in no uncertain terms, don't comment on policy. So they have to get there and nod and say, we do the best with what we have available. The reality is, you've really got to acknowledge that we've got a fantastic anti-money laundering regime. We've just handed down the biggest AML fine anywhere in the world outside the United States, but it can be only as effective as the tools that government gives to those agencies doing the work.
So in terms of the legislative catch-up, and in terms of FATFs, the international body which monitors how each country is going in complying with the global regime, that's the Financial Action Task Force, we would be ahead of, Bangladesh?
We could learn a bit from each other in the case of Bangladesh. I think the key focus here, if we take it back to something that your readers who are passionate about issues of transparency and integrity and taxation and issues like that would relate to, Australia is basically saying our children earning an honest living and paying their taxes and contributing to society have to compete at auction for houses with foreign kleptocrats, and we're cool with that. Now, I think that is just abhorrent at a social level, at a financial level, at a legal level. it's impossible to justify. But that is effectively what Australian politicians are saying to the country's young people.
So it's pushing the property.
You've got to.
The flow of black money
You've got to.
Is pushing the property prices up in metropolitan areas.
100%. Yeah. I mean, property's like a market that, it's like an illiquid stock. Only a tiny amount of the property market turns over every year. So you only need small amounts of inputs to really trigger a property boom. And of course, it's facilitated by, the credit sector, which is holding these property assets as security against the debt that they've issued. So everyone benefits when property prices go up, unless, of course, you don't own property. So, it's a really big social issue, and people need to join the dots, I believe.
Has the money flow, the potential black money flow, or what we estimate to be the black money flow, how has COVID, how's the pandemic influenced that? Is the flow of China money stopped, and how does it actually get in here? Is it a matching process through Hong Kong by financiers or law firms? Just those two things. How does it actually get here?
Yep.
And has the flow continued through the last 6 months?
Sure. So it gets here through a multitude of channels. Casinos are a good one. There's a casino inquiry happening in New South Wales right now that I'd suggest anyone that's interested in this should go and have a look at Steve Vickers talking about the way this works. It's fantastic. I mean, people might be astounded to know that, for instance, we have this incredible anti-money laundering regime that covers casinos. They take it very seriously, but unfortunately, when they drafted these laws, they forgot to include junket operators in the laws. So a casino can carve out a little bit of its floor space and give it to a junket operator who takes the money from the kleptocrats and banks it and then starts gambling it. Now, the casino's client is the junket operator. So there's a firewall there between the source of illicit funds and the casino, and this is perfectly legal and legitimate.
And it needs to be amended, obviously.
Well, I would hope that will be the New South Wales Casino Inquiry has ripped the Band-Aid off this situation. One would hope that the government will immediately plug that loophole in the anti-money laundering laws.
What are the other avenues?
Other avenues, back-to-back loans out of China is a good one, where you've got the banks in Hong Kong that will sort of issue a loan in Australia and back it up with a corresponding debt in China. So they act as the intermediaries to intermediate these money transfers. Another great one that your listeners will love is Cuckoo Smurfing. So that's where you have this beautifully vertically integrated organised crime structure where, let's say, Chinese triads bring precursor chemicals and methamphetamine into Australia. That generates an enormous amount of cash, turning a worthless chemical into, by the magic of drug controls, turning it into a very, very precious substance in Australia. They make massive amounts of money off that, which is cash. They need to get that into the system. Fortunately, there's a corresponding issue in China where you've got capital controls. So there's a huge number of Chinese nationals that want assets outside China. So they can go to their underground lender, their triad, whatever it might be, call it what you will, and say, I want to buy a house in Australia. And so there will be a matching up in effect. So they give them access to the money in Australia into the account. That gets put in and it's proceeds of crime. It's the illicit money going into their bank account, which they then use to buy property. And then they pay back the triad or the underground banker in yuan in China. So it's a beautiful merry-go-round, really, where the illicit drugs...
There's no actual transfer of money either. It's just...
There's no movement of money.
It's an honour. It's an honour commitment then among criminals.
Let's call it a netting off.
Not all criminals.
It's a netting off. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a book entry. Yeah, absolutely. So you net those transactions off, and the person, the drug syndicate gets their nice clean yuan in China, and the person with, potentially honestly earned money in China gets their house in Australia. They might not even know that the money they bought it with was tainted with, cocaine and methamphetamine and blood and things like that.
Why do they call it cuckoo smurfing?
Well, the cuckoo bird lays his eggs in another's nest. So it's the same concept. You go and try to make a legitimate transfer, and the cuckoo smurf, being the dodgy money runner, drops the dirty money in your account and you're not aware of it. So the AFP has really targeted this. Unfortunately, for people sending money, I'm talking about people sending legitimate money from countries like Vietnam and China, where they have capital controls, they have to go through these underground channels and remitters. And the AFP has been seizing money on the basis that it's proceeds of crime. And so the person in the foreign country that sent their legitimate money via the remitter doesn't have his money because the AFP have seized it and it's sitting in a Commonwealth bank account. And the AFP says, you need to come to us and prove that it was legitimate funds. And ultimately, their money's disappeared. So they're out of pocket. In some cases, there's been people that have lost $5 million, and they're taking these cases all the way to the High Court. So, it's a very murky, complicated area. And Australia has a completely mixed scorecard. We've got, as I said before, one of the best financial intelligence units. We've got really great work going on in this space. But then we've got these huge legislative and policy loopholes that, unfortunately, due to probably the kinds of issues that you cover extensively on your site, Michael, the lobbying powers, political donations, lobbying, game of mates is what's standing in the way of proper reform here.
Fantastic. And finally, where to here, Nathan, for you? Are there any other large cases behind the scenes being investigated at the moment? There must be quite a bit going on. Is Westpac alone, or is it just the standout example of outperformance in money laundering compliance failure? Is anybody got a patch on Westpac, or is that it?
Look, you've got these issues. You've got these issues everywhere. It's really complicated stuff.
Yeah.
So much money moves through a bank. The core issue is when you discover a problem, what do you do? And that's the differentiator. So in this instance, when Westpac and Commonwealth Bank discovered problems, they tried to bury them, obfuscate, bully the regulator, all sorts of stuff. So the question that the financial services industry is now asking is, Austrac's it's a small agency. It's probably got the capacity to take on one massive case at a time. So it's like a hot potato. When a CEO settles one of these suits, it knows that the hot potato is going down the line. So it went from, Matt Common at CBA, he handballed it down to Brian Hartzer. And now Hartzer's successor, Peter King, has handballed it somewhere else. Austrac said yesterday they're looking to take on another big case involving a non-banking financial services player. Now, we couldn't possibly speculate on who that might be, but if I had any pals in this field, I'd be telling them to pay attention. We don't want to name anyone, but yeah, those pals should definitely be paying attention and pretty concerned, I would think, because there's another player that I had a piece that went on the Australian discussing another entity that's potentially got hundreds of millions of IFTI reporting breaches. Possibly not the same underlying sensitivity around what was going on, but certainly it's a large-scale case and it involves a non-Australian entity.
Terrific. Thank you for your time, Nathan. It's been terrific to catch up and have a chat to you. See you face to face.
Great to see you again, Michael. I hope you're staying healthy over there and not licking handrails and staying in your COVID bubble and getting lots of surfing in.
Mate. I've got the hand wash going all the time. Change behaviours.
Awesome.
Good on you, mate.
Yep. We'll see you next time.
Good on you. Thanks, Nathan.